$500 billion is being generated to France every year by these African countries. Who is this African country that is generating $500 billion to France every year and still remaining poor? These are the Francophone countries that were colonized by France during the colonial period. But how is France still making money from these African countries? These are countries that were colonized by France during the colonial period, but in one or two ways, France still have a way of controlling their resources through neocolonialism. France is being known to hold 14 African country national reserves in their treasuries. But if France held 14 African country national reserves in their own France treasury, but why is France really doing this? Okay, to every oppression there is a revolution. Some of these countries demanded their freedom from French influence, but you will say that some of these countries got their independence during the 1960s, the 1961. Which independence do they need again, or which freedom do they need? They need a form of free trade and free freedom of right and French influence in their country. Let's talk about how France has drained African countries of their natural resources and put them in debt, directly or indirectly, or in one way or the other, or using their own country leader as a puppet through neocolonialism. Let's talk about how France stole these sub-Saharan African countries and turned it to the Francophone countries. They are now controlled by French influence and French policies. But okay, if we want to talk about it, how did France came to Africa? And how did it actually started? Okay, to understand this, we need to go back in time to during the colonial period of how Europe came to Africa. So it all started when the Europeans were tired of fighting themselves for colony. So Europeans needed a new place to colonize. So they sought out for a new continent, and this new continent was Africa. In 1884, the European leaders gathered in Berlin to talk about how to share Africa. Rather than them fighting themselves the way they used to for colony, they said, okay, come together, let's talk about it peacefully. You take this part of Africa, I take this part of Africa. Let's share Africa on our own benefit, on our own right. Some people consider this conference to be one of the greatest conferences ever held in history by the Europeans to talk about how to share Africa like a loaf of bread. But the funny part about this conference is that no African leaders was invited to this Berlin conference, how they want to share African land and countries. Some people say, why do they need to gather in Berlin to talk about how to share Africa? It was needed because in the history of Europe, all they do is about fighting each other to get a colony. But instead of them to repeat that same step in Africa, they said that, okay, no, we don't want to do that. Come together, let's talk about how to share Africa to ourselves. So it was called the Berlin Conference, but some people refer this conference as the Congo Conference of 1884. So during the 1500s and the 1800s, the Europeans were all in Africa. Some people call it the scramble of Africa. So they were all over Africa, taking here and there. During the 1800s, Africa has become the biggest market for the Europeans. They now trade in Africa and send some of the profit back to their own leaders or their government back home. During the 1800s, the Europeans had taken all over Africa. France had taken some of the sub-Saharan Africa, and this was like a scramble for Africa. Everybody need a piece of African land and a piece of African resources. This was all the quest for the European, what they needed to do with Africa. After the 1900s, a lot of these African countries were free. Almost all African countries were free from their colonial master. All of them got their independence. Some of these African countries got their freedom freely. Some got it through war, some got it through mutual understanding. Do you know the funny part about this freedom they got from the Europeans? It's just like a Mickey Mouse independence. Now, when colonization gone, neocolonialism came. Like, what am I saying? Colonization gone, neocolonialism came in. What is neocolonialism? Neocolonialism is a modern way of colonization that takes place in a more subsettled or easy way. So, but how does this neocolonialism work? It's a kind of economic exploitation that all these super countries that are well powerful, like the European leaders, use to exploit lower or underdeveloped countries like third world countries of their natural resources. Sometimes these super countries use the international organization like the World Bank, the IMF to make policies that favor them and keep these underdeveloped countries in their own control through debts. Now, if you see how this neocolonialism system works, but after the independence of these 14 African countries that got independent from France, France still have a form of neocolonialism running in their system in which they control the resources of these 14 African countries. These are the 14 African countries that got independent from France. Or this can be considered the Francophone countries in Africa. Except something that France still have influence in this their former colony that got independent from them through neocolonialism. Let me explain what I mean by France got an edge over this country, and France is still controlling this economy. These 14 Francophone countries, France decide who they want to do business with, who they don't do business with. France can tell this country like, hey, you are not doing business with this country, you are not doing with this person, you just do business with so country that France instruct them to do business with. France can automatically confiscate the African National Reserve into France Central Bank. France held the national reserve of 14 African countries since 1961. These are the 14 African countries that France held their national reserve since 1961. Now, where this gets more crazy is that 80% of this Francophone country reserve, they deposited into an account called operation account that is being controlled by France. I don't understand. The whole total revenue or 80% of a country reserve is deposited into one single account called operational account that is being controlled by France. This control we're talking about, these are controlled by the France Treasury. So the 80% of this country reserve is controlled by the France Treasury. Imagine 14 African countries, 80% of money is controlled by France Treasury. You can see where this $500 billion is coming from. 500 billion of this Francophone country money is held by France. France only allowed them to access 15% of their money each given year. If they need more money, they need to borrow money from France at a 15% rate. This money they are borrowing is from the 85% of their money that is being held by France. They are borrowing from. This is really mad. You can see that the neocolonialism of France is crazy. It's really mad. But let me tell you what the former France president said. French people should accept that a large amount of money in their bank account precisely come from exploitation of former colonies on the African continent. So now these African countries that are being colonized by France back then, that they give them Mickey Mouse freedom, now France claimed the right that they have the right to explore any natural resources found on the ground or anywhere in this African country. They can just come and exploit it for their own personal use. These 14 countries are forced to use colonial currency, which is the CFA, the Francophone currency by France, that is so designed and controlled by France government. So if you check what France is doing, France has been colonizing this country from generation to generation with different formats, from colonization to modern way of colonization, which is neocolonialism, or sometimes they go as far as using their own country leader as a puppet or as a tool to control their own people. African countries are coming out to say like, we don't want this anymore with France. Some of these countries are angry that France are looting them and they are not developing their country. Yeah, it could be a good thing maybe if France are doing the opposite. Maybe they collect some of these natural resources or controlling this country but developing this country. But this is a different case. Now this is where the big issue started, the coup in Africa. So some of these African countries decided that they want to remove this puppet that are being placed by France to steal their natural resources, and this puppet that are being loyal to the France government. That's where you start hearing a coup from one coup to another coup to another in Africa. Now the Europeans are angry because these countries that were loyal to France or Europe, they are now turning loyalty to Russia for aid and support. Now they say that they don't want to do business with France anymore. Countries like Mali, Burkina Faso has embraced the Russian Wagner military group to help them fight insurgency and remove the France military in their country. Do you really blame them for calling Russia for support? Because if you check what has happened, the France military has been in these countries claiming to fight insurgency, but to no avail. All they do is that they just kept there as their military bases, but no development. So they care that, okay, since France is not doing anything and France is also looting our natural resources, what should we do? France should go with their puppet African leaders that are stealing our resources. Do you think that what these countries are doing is bad? For them to say no to French influence and say that they don't need France in their country by going to a different military coup, like Burkina Faso, Mali, Gabon, all these countries are saying no to French influence? Do you think it's a really bad one for them to say no to democracy, or can I say is it democracy or democracy? Because now this is not more about the democracy of the people, because these leaders have been in this African country doing nothing. Okay, let's talk about one thing. If this African country say that France should leave their country, why is it that France don't want to leave their country? But do you think it's a good one for this African country to say no to democracy and embrace military regime? Drop your thoughts in the comment section. I'll be there to reply all your comments.